China is pursuing military, economic, and geopolitical preeminence.
Address areas of concern that we continue to have with some of the PRC behavior, particularly in the South China Sea.
美方介入是南海动荡的最大推手。
What we have now is an axis of evil. So this is a crisis that needs to be confronted.
Over the last 3 decades, both Democrats and Republicans underestimated the CCP.
That's why today I'm announcing new tariffs in key sectors of the economy.
That dramatic enough for you? I hope we've captured your attention. Good morning, everybody. I'm extremely excited to be here, back at Aspen Ideas after too many years, to chair a session, US and China edging toward the brink. Actually, the original title for this session was From Win-Win to Cold War II to World War III, ? New perspectives on the US-China relationship, but somebody toned it down, probably Tina. This is an amazing panel. You're extremely fortunate to have such a lineup of expertise before you this morning. To my immediate left, your right, Keyu Jin, who's been a professor at the London School of Economics since 2009. She has a fantastic book out, The New China Playbook, Beyond Socialism and Capitalism, which I highly recommend. Next to her is Andrew Erickson, professor of strategy at the U.S. Naval War College's China Maritime Studies Institute, also an associate of the China Aerospace Studies Institute, and a visiting professor at Harvard University's government department, and a contributor of an extremely important chapter in a new book that I'm just about to tell you about in a minute. Next to him, my old friend, David Li Daokui, professor of economics and director of the Academic Center for Chinese Economic Performance and Thinking at Tsinghua University. We got to know one another there when I was a visiting professor back before the pandemic. David was also chief economist at the New Development Bank. He was, for a time, a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China, and he was the founding dean of the Schwarzman College at Tsinghua. Last but by no means least, Matt Pottinger, a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution, a principal at Garno Global. Matt was Deputy National Security Advisor from 2019 to 2021 to President Trump. Prior to that, he was Senior Director for Asia at the National Security Council, also in the Trump administration. The book I mentioned is the book that he is just about to publish as editor, The Boiling Moat, Urgent Steps to Defend Taiwan. And Andrew's chapter in that book is a must-read. And I want to start with you, Andrew. When you're at Aspen, you're in paradise. And you're by definition members of the paradise elite. And it becomes a little difficult to imagine anything bad happening. So let me see if I can help you imagine something bad. I know it's hard, but we're all going to try. This is a quotation from an essay just published in Foreign Affairs by the historian at Yale, Arne Westad. And the title of the essay is Sleepwalking Toward War. Quote, all current evidence points toward China making military plans to one day invade Taiwan, producing a war between China and the United States, just as the Schlieffen Plan helped produce a war between Germany and Britain in 1914. Taiwan could be the Balkans of the 2020s. Both China and the United States seem to be sleepwalking toward a cross-strait confrontation. And if that's not enough to focus your mind, Admiral Samuel Paparo, the new head of US Indo-Pacific Command, told the Washington Post just the other day that in the event of a Chinese move against Taiwan, the US military would deploy thousands of unmanned submarines and surface ships to, quote, turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape. Andrew, help us understand what an unmanned hellscape is and how plausible and imminent do you find that scenario of war between the United States and China?
Well, first of all, it's a very real scenario, a very real possibility. And unfortunately, Xi Jinping is not sleepwalking. Rather, he's engaging in the largest military buildup since World War II. And you may often see the year 2027 highlighted in testimony or public commentary by US officials. We need to not view that date in isolation, but rather understand Xi Jinping's centennial military building goal of 2027. It's not a deadline for invading Taiwan, but it's a deadline for China's armed forces to give Xi Jinping the full toolkit of military capabilities to either threaten Taiwan and cow Taiwan into submitting to Xi Jinping's will, or if that doesn't work, and I don't think it will, being prepared to engage in combat operations against Taiwan. That's why this is very real.
So it was Bill Burns last year, Director of Central Intelligence, who said twice that Xi, according to US intelligence, had told the Chinese military to be ready for war by 2027. And as you say, it's an option, not some kind of explicit plan to go to war. What kind of probability should be attached to this scenario? Because this is no trivial thing. I mean, I take it seriously. After all, the CIA wasn't wrong about Russia's plan to invade Ukraine. But what's the probability of war happening in your view, Andrew?
There's no scientific answer to that, but you don't need a security clearance to know just how much Xi Jinping is upping the ante and pushing toward a period at very least of greatly heightened tension. The Pentagon's China Military Power Report of 2023, the latest edition, offers plenty of data points. Let me highlight just a few. Xi Jinping is engaged in by far the fastest and largest and virtually only nuclear weapons buildup of any nation today. And he's building up military capabilities across the board, including with many world-class superlatives, unparalleled in quantity. This is not just something for symbolic prestige or a signature effort or some effort to be seen as a great power. No, at virtually every turn, Xi Jinping is making costly, difficult, consequential decisions that represent a significant departure from his predecessors since Mao Zedong, and they're in the direction of preparing for serious war fighting. So I can't put a number on the probability. I don't think anyone can put an exact number on the probability, but it is definitely non-zero, and that is unfortunately high.
So as you can see, this is a balanced panel, and we're going to hear the Chinese side in just a moment from David and Keyu. But I want to go to Matt next with a quite simple question. How did we get here, Matt? Because I remember writing a piece for the Wall Street Journal in 2007 about Chimerica, the fusion of China and America, two economies that seem to be in some kind of symbiotic relationship with one another. And at that time, there was a pretty well-established consensus in Washington that reform and opening up had been a good thing for China and globalization had been a good thing for the United States. How can it be that in such a short time, we're now in 2024, we can be talking seriously about war between the United States and China? What, in your view, went wrong with the relationship?
Yeah, well, I think that we were a bit arrogant at the end of the Cold War. Remember the events from the 1989 fall of the Berlin Wall to the collapse of the Soviet Union just a couple of years later. That, for us, was the end. You know, it was a peaceful, successful conclusion of the Cold War. what we didn't realize was that Beijing was using that moment to inaugurate a new Cold War. And that Cold War remained quiet for the first 15 years or so, 20 years. Rush Doshi, who's a friend and until recently was President Biden's China director on the National Security Council staff, wrote a very good book called The Long Game, where he went back and read primary source material from that moment, from 89 to 91 and beyond, and found that Beijing came to regard the United States, in the absence of a Soviet menace, because China was also menaced by the Soviet Union. They didn't have very good relations in the latter decades of the Soviet Union. That China came to regard the United States as the primary military, geopolitical, and ideological adversary. And so back then, Deng Xiaoping embarked on what he called a policy of hiding and biding. Let's hide our time, hide our capabilities, bide our time until we've built up enough net power as a nation to actually challenge the United States directly. And if you fast forward then, China at that point had an economy of just a few $100 billion. China was able, through especially its entry into the World Trade Organization, but also through very important reforms to liberalize the economy up to a point. It was able to grow its economy 20 plus fold. David will know the exact figure, but I mean, China's now, what, an $18 trillion economy. So you then fast forward to the rise of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. And Xi Jinping clearly believes that the moment has come where Beijing no longer needs to really hide and bide anymore. And he gives this very important secret speech that got leaked. One of the first speeches he gave as leader in late 2012, where he tells the story of the demise of the Soviet Union. And he's using it as a parable. He's talking about what lessons the Chinese Communist Party needs to derive in order to avoid the fate. And the lessons are not that China needs to accelerate reforms or become, more pluralistic, more liberal, even economically, but rather to go back to Stalin and Lenin and Mao. And the villain of his speech is Gorbachev. He describes Gorbachev as someone who basically blew it. And he even implicitly criticizes Khrushchev as being too soft-line. He says that the cardinal sin had been criticizing the legacy of Lenin and the legacy of Stalin. So that should have been our first clue that we're going to be dealing with a very different kind of leader who was going to turn back the clock on a lot of Deng Xiaoping's successful reforms and start thinking about a global vision that he wants to pursue. And here we are 12 years later talking about the possibility of a great power war and World War III.
So I want to turn to you now, David, and get a Chinese perspective on this. I forgot to mention that you also have published a book very recently, China's Worldview, Demystifying...
Thank you.
Funny that you should have had a copy with you. And the subtitle of the book is interesting, Demystifying China to Prevent Global Conflict. So David, give us a Chinese perspective, because I imagine that your narrative of what went wrong, I mean, clearly something's gone wrong, but your narrative would be different from Matt's. In what ways would it be different?
Well, to begin with, Matt and Andrew, you are China experts. You speak fluent Chinese, Mandarin. I know. You worked in China. You work as a reporter. You're famous in China, actually, for various reasons. You were held by a police department for how many hours? I forgot. Very bad experience for something.
Well, I had mostly a pretty good experience in China. I lived in China for almost a decade and did learn the language, although it's gotten very rusty, I'm embarrassed to say. But I don't mean to interrupt you.
But my point is that we need a deeper and very deep understanding of China. The DNA of the civilization, the DNA of the history, and the DNA of behind the political thinking of today's leaders. And Matt, I respect you a lot, but with due respect, I disagree with your analysis. I believe that the reason for the 12 years huge change from Qing America to Cold War is because misunderstanding of China, which created a very aggressive policy of the US, mostly under President Trump. And then that creates reaction within China, and then escalate to today's situation. Now, what is the DNA of China? First of all, communism is not actually what you believe, you understand, in the name of the Chinese Communist Party. I explain in the book, right after the collapse of the former Soviet Union, what were the leaders in China talking about? They were talking about, very seriously, dropping the name communism from the name of the party. Seriously, I have very official archive, okay? Then they decided, we don't drop it, because we respect history. That's the DNA of China. History should be respected. If they argue, we drop the name communism, then many people in China and their parents, their grandparents who sacrificed their life in civil war will revolt against the ruling party. So instead, they kept the name communism, which is now very, very much a worrisome phrase in today's US politics. Communism, right? Very bad name. By the way, if you check the constitution of North Korea is not a communist country. North Korea dropped the name communism and Marxism from its constitution many years ago. Russia, Vladimir Putin, can be anti-Lenin as far as you can go. Putin is a huge anti-communist champion. So anyway, so the deep misunderstanding. What is the fundamental thinking of China? The fundamental thinking of today's China is for China to regain international respect, not by challenging the US. I repeat, China is not in a position or is not intending to challenge the US as a superpower, as a country, for good or for bad, having made huge impact in today's world. China wants to regain respect through economic prosperity and through making contributions in climate change or in other areas to the human history. China lost that respect for the past 150 years. You know this better than I do, since the Opium War, right? Since the Opium War. So China became a livestock of, at least in China, we believe so. We became a livestock of Western civilizations. So finally, through reform and opening up, China gained this respect. And then just when China's economy become 65% as large as the US come back and say, oh, you are number 2. You are going to challenge us. You are going to change the world order. You will replace the US, so we will crack down on you. And these generated the whole dynamism, including the troubles in Taiwan Strait. So that's my simple, 1 minute summary of my book.
So, David, let me push back a little bit. It's typical in debates about Cold War that each side blames the other. And those of you of a certain age in this audience, I know it's a very youthful group. Some of you may remember the first Cold War. There was a great debate about who started that too. And in a way, we're getting a new version of this, where Matt says it was Xi Jinping who started it, and you're really saying it was Trump who started it. But are you saying, David, that it's simply wrong on the part of US intelligence to believe that China is preparing for war by 2027? Is that just wrong?
It's wrong. Of course, I'm not connected with the Chinese intelligence and military complex. But as far as I know, the 2027 timetable for China to attack Taiwan, to take over Taiwan, is totally unfounded. 2027 is the centennial anniversary of the PLA, People's Liberation Army. Right? So the rhetoric is to have a strong and well-respected army. That's the rhetoric. It's not Taiwan, no Taiwan. By the way, we discussed this a lot, Neil, whenever we meet, okay? You have to understand the personality of Xi in comparison with Putin. They are almost the opposite to each other. Putin is a, mafioso, right? Weightlifting, judo, tank, motorcycle, horse riding guy. You know, nothing wrong with that, right? You're a Marine Corps, right? You're supposed to follow the culture. You served in the Marine Corps. You also didn't know. Anyway, she's different. She grew up by staying, by relaxed, by watching other people making operations, by staying with whatever he has, and then wait for the moment to then gradually rise up within the hierarchy. Within the hierarchy, we discuss this. So in other words, Putin is preemptive guy, preemptive. He would take action before the enemy, before the rivalry take. The China is almost the opposite, Yeah, so that.
But David, if they're so different, why do they spend so much time together? I mean, is this some kind of weird...
Good question, good question.
Is this some kind of
good question. Do you know, a small quiz,
story?
Do you know which two countries in the world share the longest land border? 3,000 to 4,000 miles, China and Russia, not U.S. and Canada. The two countries share huge amount of border. And frankly speaking, people like me in China, we are whispering every day about potential Russia trouble for China in the long term, not today, in the long run, because Russia share his huge border with China, and Russia never felt comfortable because much of the land was taken during the Qing dynasty 200 years ago through treaties, whatever fair or equal treaty. So Russians always worry that China will take back the land. So Russia become always suspicious of China. And China also felt uncomfortable with Russia. So the two countries have to stabilize relationship. We are neighbors. We do not want to offend our neighbors. By the way, China is also supporting Ukraine. China is Ukraine's largest trade partner, even today. President Zelensky never openly criticized China. China is trying to make peace, trying to be good friends on both sides.
Well, I'm very tempted to jump in here by commenting on that point, since it seems to me that China's supplying an enormous number of not only dual-use items of hardware, but according at least to British intelligence, lethal hardware to Russia. And without that, it would be hard for Russia to sustain its war effort. But I want to come back to that because it's time we brought Keyu into the conversation. Keyu, your book is, I think, very illuminating about the different generations that we see in China. The generation in power that Xi Jinping personifies is the generation shaped by the Cultural Revolution. But if one looks a little further ahead, the next generation doesn't seem to have anything like the same preoccupations. I mean, I don't know how much you worry about this war scenario, and maybe you should tell us if it's something you worry about. And if it's not, is there a reason to imagine that, I don't know, 10 years from now, the mood will be quite different because there'll be a generational change in politics in both countries?
I do want to come back to the new generation in a little bit because they will shape China's future, politically, economically, and impact on the world. So that's an important point. Even if China doesn't change as a country, as a political system, the people change, you have practically a different country. But first of all, let me just comment on a few other things that have been previously mentioned. As you rightly pointed out, to say that this is all China's fault seems like it's a little bit beyond belief. It's important to see, not just apply just one American perspective on everything. It's important to see the other perspective. First of all, China rejects the notion that China and U.S. are in a current Cold War. You're not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to be animostic towards the Americans on Chinese social media. So just taming the nationalism in China. What do the Chinese think about all of this, right? Coming back to some of what David has said. Chinese believe it's competition. Number two, rising up so fast, catching up to number one, economically and technologically speaking. It's not political, it's not ideological, according to the Chinese, because look at Japan. In the 1980s, Japan was an ally, democracy. It swept the country with Japanese electronics, exports of cars, and most importantly, it won the semiconductors race. What did the US do? Same set of policies. tariff wars, limiting Japanese investment, involuntary export controls, and the Plaza Accord forcing the Japanese to appreciate. There was no ideological differences there. What did the Japanese do? They submitted because US was the big guy and it was the ally. The problem is China's not going to submit. China is going to go as far as it can. It believes it has the right to pedal its way to prosperity, into technological and economic prosperity. That is kind of along the same lines with David's point, but that's the Chinese view. But that said, what has compounded the problem is there has been woefully bad communication between the two and an utter lack of mutual cultural appreciation. So my point is, it's both of them that got to where we are today. Speaking about cultural misguidance, China, did it really need to announce Made in China 2025? China's going to dominate in all strategic emerging sectors? Boof, that was a Sputnik moment that spooked Americans, and on came this onslaught of export controls and all that stuff. But Chinese pronouncing they want to be number one, that is so common. It's President Xi, but it's all the universities I've interviewed with. Every one of them want to be number one in Asia by 2030. It's the Chinese students. I made the mistake of doing the same when I first got to the US. It's a cultural phenomenon. Now, coming back to the US, did the US need to unleash all these demonization of China and these policy and tariff wars and export controls, making the Chinese believe that the sole goal of the US is to hold it down? That's miscommunication problem. There's even little communication between the two in times of urgency, and I think that is dangerous.
Can I pursue one part of that? And that's kind of popular attitudes. It's very hard to gauge those, of course, because there are no opinion polls that we can rely on. And there's clearly nationalism in China. As you say, the regime actually has to rein it in on social media. Yeah. But nationalism and being ready to go to war are different things. And what I can't judge, and this is where the analogy with Germany pre-1914 is quite helpful, is how psychologically ready for war the Chinese people are. The German population was mentally ready for war by 1914. That was very clear. But I'm not so sure about China today. How psychologically ready for war are ordinary Chinese people if a crisis over Taiwan suddenly breaks out?
I think you pointed out the right question. What concerns Chinese in their daily lives is not war and national rejuvenation because of Taiwan. It's still, are our kids going to be educated? Are we going to afford the housing, for our kids to get married and stuff like that? But coming back to the issue of Taiwan, and we talked about this 2027, I want to totally agree with David. There's no such timeline. If there's ever going to be a timeline, maybe 2049, because hear me out here. I disagree with the point of view that there has been a radical change towards Taiwan on the part of Xi. Let me tell you why. Pretty much what he has been saying has been pretty much the party guideline since. Okay, Taiwan, inalienable part of China. 1995, 2000 white papers, not rule out military force or other drastic measures in the event of independence or grave turn of events. 1995, 2000 white papers. Reunification is essential for national rejuvenation, goes back to 1997 by Jiang Zemin. Now, the more important issue is if China believes that there is a permanent loss of Taiwan, that there is no route towards unification by peaceful means or whatever means, then that's the problem. So it's condition-driven rather than timeline-driven.
So this is a great opportunity to go back to you, Eric. But before I do that, just let me tell you that in half an hour, we're opening this up to the floor. And you better have good questions. So start thinking about them now, because I may cold call you if there are no good questions. In the next half hour, we're going to go from this rather formal panel that we've had so far, in which everybody has been very restrained, into something that's a lot more dynamic. I want to encourage you to disagree with one another and to not to interrupt one another, but can you gesticulate to me, Matt, when you want to disagree with anything that's said? So we're gonna speed things up. It's going to get a little bit more feisty while you're thinking up your difficult questions. Okay, Eric. Keyu just said Chinese policy on Taiwan hasn't really changed. There's been continuity. And she might have said, though she didn't, that actually the US has intermittently appeared to shift its policy away from strategic ambiguity towards something more like an unequivocal commitment to Taiwan. How do you see that fundamental issue? Has there been continuity in Chinese policy on this issue? Is there any discontinuity on the US side? What's your take?
It's true that since roughly 1943, when the Chinese Communist Party started claiming Taiwan as a sovereign territory of a future PRC, that this has been a major Chinese Communist Party goal, gaining control of Taiwan in some way. But one of the many ways in which Xi Jinping is very different from his predecessors is his lack of patience. His predecessors, of course, pushed these and other core Chinese Communist Party policy goals, but the difference was they were patient. They considered this something that could be addressed many years in the future. We're not seeing that patience anymore with Xi Jinping. And let's be clear about 2027. It's the centennial military building goal. No serious U.S. government source is saying that that is a deadline or a timeline for invasion. It's clearly, though, an effort on the part of China's armed forces under Xi Jinping to have a full toolbox of military capabilities ready to engage in any military scenario vis-a-vis Taiwan that Xi Jinping orders them to do. And if you look at what China's actually doing in terms of this meteoric military buildup, you can see this very clearly.
And that's one of the big differences between now and, say, the mid-1990s when Bill Clinton was president. Then there was such a huge asymmetry between the US and China that the US could send a naval force to the Taiwan Strait and China simply had to back down. And your point is that soon won't be the case. Maybe it's already not the case. David, can I go to you, because I know you wanted to jump in. You have said to me that it is Xi's personal goal for Taiwan to come under the CCP, under Beijing's control, on his watch. And this is, in many ways, the kind of capstone goal of his political career. Does that not create a new pressure, to Andrew's point, that we are suddenly much closer to a moment of crisis than in previous eras? What's your view?
No, actually, Xi says one line, oftentimes, again. He says that I do not care whether something some goal is achieved during my tenure, so long as it is achieved. There's a Chinese expression, I want to achieve something, okay? Maybe one generation, 2 generations down the road, I do not care whether it is done today. This is, you know what I mean, right? 功不在我. It's a very specific expression in Chinese. It's hard to translate. Okay, a second point I want to quickly add to Matthew, your point. It is the U.S. policy, by U.S. I mean the White House combined with the Capitol Hill, right? Which in Chinese description is slicing the sausage. You know, with a slicing sausage, right? Like Spanish sausage, you cut it, slice. You move again, you push. You push the issue on Taiwan. There are many documents, very, very technical. You brought a huge paper here. Taiwan policies, right? U.S. issued many policies. Each step is inching towards supporting. Taiwan independence, setting more armament. So it is, to be fair, I think the U.S. side is trying to play up the Taiwan issue to irritate China to get into a war.
Well, this is something that Xi Jinping said it was revealed just the other day that he said to Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, the US is trying to goad China into war over Taiwan. Matt, what was your reaction to that story, which I found very interesting?
It reminded me that that's exactly what Vladimir Putin said right before invading Ukraine. He said the United States is trying to trap me into coming into a war. This is psychological warfare. I don't know if Xi Jinping really said that to Ursula von der Leyen. It's an FT report, so probably something along those lines. But let me just step back a little bit, because long before President Trump was in office, when he actually pursued a new U.S. strategy, really reacting to the reality of China systematically harming U.S. interests and those of our allies, Xi Jinping back in 2012, his first trip after he was elevated to General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, so this was in early 2013, where'd he go? His first foreign trip was to go visit Vladimir Putin. He's met with Vladimir Putin in person somewhere between 40 and 50 times since then. So basically every quarter for the last dozen years, those two get together. Xi Jinping has made teaming up with Vladimir Putin a cornerstone of his strategy. It is not about just managing his border with Vladimir Putin, right? I mean, let's take a look at what our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, said publicly when he was in Beijing just in April. He said that China is overwhelmingly the #1 supporter of the war effort by Russia against Ukraine, its European neighbor. The amount of support has skyrocketed beginning last March of 2023 is when we saw an absolute skyrocketing of Chinese material support for the war. Tony Blinken says that support may have changed the course of the war. It had the effect, in Tony Blinken's view, Russia probably wouldn't have been able, may very well not have been able to sustain the war in Ukraine if not for China's military support. This is equipment. It's all the things that go into rocket fuel and into explosives. It's all the chip guidance systems that are going into Iranian kamikaze drones that are killing thousands of civilians right now in Ukraine. Xi Jinping views the war in Ukraine as an essential part of his strategy for weakening the West, and he's been talking about it for years. In 2021, Xi Jinping gave a speech where he said, the most important characteristic in the world today is chaos, 大乱. And he goes on in the speech to say that this trend will continue and the trends are on China's side. Okay, so I don't think this is a misunderstanding. If anything, we've underestimated by not paying sufficient attention to what Xi Jinping himself is saying when he's talking to his own party leadership, as opposed to what he might be trying to broadcast to the outside world in nice audiences like this one. If we want to look at communication as being a problem, how to explain the fact that China has systematically evicted every American journalist who speaks Chinese. They're no longer allowed in China. They can't even come to cover a short event. Beijing does not want people who understand China coming in. It's because Beijing has invested billions of dollars in trying to monopolize all discourse about China.
With New York Times, Brett
Yes,
Keith Bradshaw.
Keith is a friend of mine. He doesn't speak Chinese, but he's a great reporter.
No, he understands China.
The only reporter that they allowed to stay from the United States was Keith Bradshaw, because he has to depend on government-provided, in some cases, government-provided translators. He's the only one that they allowed to stay. Everyone else has been booted out. New York Times, all the other publications. And so, I've been banned from China after I gave a speech. You were talking about respecting history. I gave a speech about 100 years of China's history, starting with the May 4th movement after World War I. And I was banned for having delivered that speech. So what Beijing is investing in is what it calls 话语权. There's billions of dollars into dominating discourse in every language, in every country. This is why you have TikTok being flooded with anti-American, anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic content, pro-Russian, pro-Venezuelan, pro-North Korea, pro-Communist Party content.
There's zero. I challenge you. I challenge you coming up with credible evidence that TikTok's opinions, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas, is back to China. I challenge you. Can you provide any single case in which the opinion of pro?
So luckily, Congress
this would warm up.
The U.S. Congress, a bipartisan committee late last year, did a whole hearing on this, where they looked at the metrics were actually the ones that at the time were provided by TikTok itself. And they compared what kind of content trends on Instagram and X and all these other platforms. And they found it was equal on anything that was politically neutral. If you're talking about Taylor Swift, it's exactly the same level of content on TikTok as you get on Instagram. But then if you're talking about something that is anti-American, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel, it starts to take off by multiples and then multiples of multiples on TikTok. Now, this shouldn't be a mystery to us. Beijing controls the algorithms because the Chinese...
Are you publishing this in Science, the magazine?
Well,
you will be rejected.
Who is the editor-in-chief of ByteDance? Do you know who the editor-in-chief is of ByteDance, which is the parent company that controls?
That's a parent company. TikTok is totally different. It's all U.S. company.
So I'll answer the question. The Chinese Communist Party secretary appointed by the central government to govern all apps and content under ByteDance. TikTok is one of the apps under ByteDance. He is the editor-in-chief and the
operation-wise, the TikTok is totally independent.
One thing that's true, though, David, is, and this is one really for you, Keyu, TikTok's Chinese equivalent is a very different thing from the TikTok that we have in the United States.
Same editors, same back office, same engineers, same algorithms, tweaked to deliver radically different content. It's to build up the Communist Party's image in China, and here it's to disintegrate the fabric that ties our pluralistic democracy together.
Keyu, can I ask you a particular question about how the Chinese see the world? David made the very interesting point earlier that there's considerable suspicion between China and Russia, despite the no-limits partnership between Xi and Putin. This is music to the ears of American policymakers who would like nothing better than for there to be another China-Russia split as there was in the First Cold War. What's your sense of how ordinary Chinese people think about the no-limits partnership? Or do they not think about it?
No, of course they think about it. I mean, history has proven you just can't trust, Soviet Union, Russia, and it's a short-term relationship. But I would say that if the U.S. had not just completely kicked away China, maybe China wouldn't have such great relations with Russia, right? They are edging towards together because it needs to balance that relationship. But I do challenge the framing that Matt has come up with, the premises, right? Because the foisting of the model, of the Chinese model onto the world or causing a Western disintegration, I'm sorry, that's way exaggerating Chinese capabilities and the scope of its ambitions. I wouldn't flatter the Chinese to think that. China just believes, and again, rightly or wrongly, China can just stand aside and look at whatever the threat it is to democracy itself. The biggest threat to the U.S. is not China, it's the U.S. itself, just like China is its own biggest threat. So that model of foisting Chinese development model or authoritarianism to the rest of the world, I just don't agree with that.
You said something really interesting there, that the biggest threats to China are China itself. Say a bit more about that, because one important aspect of this debate is what is going on inside China, inside the Chinese economy, and also within China's youth, where youth unemployment has become such a sensitive issue that they don't publish statistics on it anymore. I mean, maybe we in the US are worrying too much about China's strength and underestimating its inner weaknesses. How do you see those demographic problems or debt-related problems? Is your view of the Chinese economy pessimistic over a 10-year time horizon or more optimistic?
So this is precisely the point that, China's economic challenges are very real. So are they really thinking about creating extra chaos and external challenges that would cost, massive economic catastrophes when its most serious challenges are internal?
Because the classic question that people ask, a typical historian's question is, isn't the most dangerous time when an authoritarian regime starts to run into economic trouble or social trouble? Isn't that when it's most likely to take strategic risk? And Hull Brands has made this argument in his recent work. So help me understand this. You're saying the opposite.
Yeah, the legitimacy of the Communist Party today is still primarily pragmatic and economic. And the youth unemployment, just think about this. I mean, the youth came out to protest. Within a fortnight, China dismantled the longest, most draconian lockdown. Okay, and youth, now there's unemployment. By the way, for all the things that you've said about Xi dialing back, Xi has never said no to any opening up policies to foreign financial institutions, swap connects, bond connects. Tesla is being subsidized by the Shanghainese government, driving all around the Chinese streets. She has canceled visa requirements for a number of European countries. Why? Opening up more. So that global integration is still there. And for all the chaos that you've mentioned, he has also said, we will not tolerate chaos in the region.
So does that mean that we should expect a rather different tone from the July 3rd plenum, which is just coming up, which has been postponed? I mean, that's going to make the news here in the US. What's the message going to be? That reform and opening up is back?
A lot of it is going to be economic.
Right.
And coming back to your question, high debts, high youth unemployment, economic growth slowing down. 900 million people still vastly undereducated, underemployed, not reaching middle income by international standards. People not being able to afford housing for their children to procreate. These are real issues. That's what the Chinese people talk about. We don't hear about Taiwan and going to war as a way to kind of mobilize the national psyche. It's about economics. And I won't go into details, but there have been a return to pragmatism. And this is always a pendulum swing. In times of confidence, more Mao. In times of crisis, more Deng.
Do you agree with that, David?
I fully agree. The key word, pragmatism. Okay, I think that's a theme of the past 2 years of central government, Chinese central government policy adjustment. Number one, dealing with the U.S. Talk to Biden, talk to President Biden, talk to Brink, talk to Jack Sullivan. They are very pragmatic, open, frank. And also, I think in the back, they had a lot of diplomatic negotiations and concessions made. Okay? And second, on economic issues, major efforts are being put in place. I think in about 3 weeks, there will be a statement of next step of economic reform. 3 areas: housing market reform, the local government debt reform, and reforms to stimulate domestic consumption, to absorb Chinese production capacity.
So, Andrew, could it be that both these things are true? In other words, that China is focused on trying to raise its growth rate, overcome the challenges that Keyu and David are talking about, but its military is also at least preparing for the possibility of war. Those things are not necessarily incompatible. I am much more worried about our readiness for such a conflict than I am about TikTok. Let's talk about the United States' capacity to cope if there is a Taiwan crisis. As I understand it, and you know this much better than I do, every war game, or nearly every war game, that the US has conducted, whether it's within the military, within the government, or by think tanks, has delivered a pretty negative outcome for a Taiwan crisis. The United States is not well placed to cope with a Taiwan crisis. Is that something that concerns you? And if it is, where are US weaknesses in a strictly military or naval regard?
First of all, multiple things are true at once. But when we talk about top-level PRC policies, we need to be talking about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We shouldn't be talking about the Chinese. It's a large country of over 1.4 billion people, so many of whom don't have a voice because of draconian Chinese Communist Party censorship, especially with this extreme high-tech panopticon that's being further developed under Xi Jinping. So I know, of course, people who live in China and have contacts have many insights from personal contacts, from knowledge of the system. But let's not pretend that the Chinese people have a chance to give their full voice to things. The Chinese Communist Party works very hard to ensure that that cannot and will not be the case. Now, in terms of where things are trending, I think I agree in part with Hal Brand's and Michael Beckley's argument. China's rate of national growth is slowing down. By the 2030s, it will be in a very different situation, first and foremost because of the very rapidly aging society, thanks in part to the tragic one-child policy, and nothing's going to change that. Too little, too late. The problem for international security is that over the next few years, with each passing year, the amount of new weapon systems that China's armed forces under Xi will be deploying is nothing short of staggering. It's already very significant. And this is an unclassified tabulation of those systems, not a list of U.S. policies toward Taiwan. So how does this all stack up? Well, the unsatisfying answer is at the unclassified level, you're not going to get the full answer. And there are so many factors into this, it's extremely complicated, and hopefully we won't have to find out. I don't think that media reports about U.S. war games or speculation about them is indicative, because if you want a war game to be useful, it should be as challenging and stressing as possible. You know, not a layup that you know you're going to make. So I don't think that is a useful indicator. I am optimistic that the U.S. is going to be continually able to deter Xi Jinping from making a military operational move against Taiwan for the foreseeable future. But the next few years are going to be very difficult. The situation is far more urgent and difficult than most people realize, and so it is going to take tremendous effort on the part of the U.S. together with key allies and partners.
My concern is when I read what I'm able to read, I see evidence that in the event of a conventional war, let's suppose a scenario where China blockades Taiwan, doesn't invade it, but it imposes a blockade. The US sends a naval expeditionary force and shots are exchanged. CSIS did a war game in which the US ran out of precision missiles, one category of precision missiles, within a week because the stocks are so depleted. Do you worry that the US is not ready for prime time, and in a scenario of a confrontation would be in a much weaker position than it was, say, in the mid-1990s or even 10 years ago?
Yeah. Well, I speak with senior officers in the Indo-Pacific Command. I think that they are confident that Beijing would not prevail right now in a contest with the United States, a conventional war. That doesn't negate the point that you're making, which is one that Andrew and I have been making in our book, The Boiling Moat, which is that the United States has to actually seriously, quickly reform our defense industrial base, because it has atrophied over the course of the first couple decades of this century when we've been fighting counterinsurgencies, right? We didn't have much need. We needed young men and women. We didn't need elaborate stockpiles of anti-ship weapons and things of that nature. This is very much solvable, okay? We actually, even as we've wrestled in this book with some of the most dire scenarios that you started with, with this presentation today, I mean, it's really ugly scenarios that we want to avoid. In spite of that, we came out pretty optimistic that this is a war that can be deterred, so long as the United States in particular, but also Japan and Taiwan. I've just come back from meeting with Taiwan's President Lai and with some Japanese leaders as well, talking about the book. If we take these steps, which are not so egregiously expensive, we can actually build up the stockpiles to show that we could stay in a prolonged war. It's important that Xi Jinping understands that we can fight not just a short war, but a long one. That's imperative if he's going to be persuaded not to do something as fateful as launching a blockade, which is an act of war, or an invasion.
So deterrence has not been one of the strong points of this administration, Joe Biden's administration. They haven't really successfully deterred the Taliban, they didn't successfully deter Putin, they didn't successfully deter Iran and its proxies.
Yeah.
I want to ask one last question before we go to the audience, and that is, does the election make a difference? When I was in Beijing just a few weeks ago, I was surprised when Chinese officials said to me, it doesn't matter to us who wins the US election, both candidates are anti-China. Does it make a difference who wins this election for this, not for the general future, but for the specific issue of US-China relations?
Look, I think that Beijing was flummoxed by President Trump. They miscalculated and thought that they could bully him off of the tariffs that he put in place. Remember, when President Trump pursued those tariffs in 2018, it was actually fairly narrow. It was a very reasonable, reactive policy of the United States to say, for Chinese companies that have benefited from rampant theft of American intellectual property, we should be able to put a tariff on those companies that have benefited from that. So the original tariffs were only on about $35 billion worth of Chinese exports, less than 10% of what China sells us. Beijing thought that it could counter and bully President Trump into cutting some kind of a deal where we would withdraw all of those tariffs, and it didn't work. And in fact, Beijing was the one that escalated. President Trump was happy to continue escalating because we buy $5 worth of stuff from China for every dollar of goods and services that we sell to China. So I think that Beijing is going to have a tougher time with President Trump. I think Beijing has been heartened by the failure of deterrence under President Biden. I would love to see President Biden's team learn from the mistakes of Afghanistan, of the Ukraine war, of what's happened with the terrorist attacks on Israel. We've failed, as you said, to deter. We have to start doing something a little bit different from what we've been doing if we're going to restore that deterrence.
Keyu, obviously one of the most striking things about the last few years is the continuity of policy between the Trump and Biden administrations on China. Tariffs didn't get taken away. In fact, we're now talking about more tariffs on electric vehicles under Joe Biden. The tech war actually escalated. You could argue that it was Joe Biden's restrictions on semiconductors that really hit China harder than anything that Trump did on the tech front. So there's real continuity. But do you agree with the idea that it doesn't matter who the next president is, or is there some difference that you discern?
Well, I think the worry is that, you know, if Trump were elected and there was more polarization and pushing the Chinese leader into a corner to have more aggressive diplomatic responses, that is actually a more dangerous world. But this is probably the right time to bring in the newer generation. Speaking about, you know, Trump coming in, it's very clear in the international surveys that the younger generation was quite pro-West, thinking about the Western democratic systems, and that quickly turned in 2016. 2017. That's the time around, you know, all these things start to happen. But if we want to learn about the Chinese people, we got to understand how the new generation think. Talking about Leninist, Marxist, these young generation are not Leninists and Marxists. They account for 85% of Chinese borrowing. They are huge spenders of luxury goods. They like to travel. They like to enjoy leisure. This is a different China. The China that you were afraid of were the Foxconn workers that were opting for 3 shifts a night just to earn that extra $2. That's not the new youth. The new youth prefers to lie flat in their parents' home and wait for a better job. They're highly educated. It's the cycle of renewal. That China is not the old model. That critique doesn't apply to them anymore. And speaking about one more thing, I think the view that I think is widely held view that Chinese people have no voice, that is also misplaced. Last year, there were 11,000 protests organized on social media over land use rights alone, not to mention the tens of thousands of others on real estate, stock market crisis, etc. To effectuate change is happening in China. You don't like something, 1/3 of the social media criticisms are about the government.
So never the head of the government.
Never the head of, that's the rule. You got the rule.
Highly suppressed. That's the stuff that gets through. Highly suppressed.
You can't actually censor an item overnight. It's already becoming a national taboo. Anyway.
So I just want to say, okay, I think the generation of Chinese that Keyu is describing should be our natural allies. I have high hopes for the current generation, the new generation in China. I think if they were given the chance to elect their leader, they would not elect a Marxist-Leninist who, on the 200th birthday of Marx, visited Marx's grave in the UK.
They may elect a Chinese Putin.
Well, this is
seriously.
But that's
seriously.
I
have more faith
we could quite easily keep this up for not only half an hour, but half a day, perhaps half a week. By the way, the point that Matt just made is made more at greater length in an article he published with Mike Gallagher in Foreign Affairs recently, which I also recommend. There'll be a reading list distributed at the end of the class, and the exam is on Monday.
And Gallagher can't go to China.
And he's, I'm kind of embarrassed that I can still go to China. What does that say? It shows that I'm a neutral moderator. We'd like some questions from the audience now. I can see hands going up in agreeably large numbers. There are roving microphones. Can can the microphone rovers just signal to me? Could you bring a microphone down to the gentleman who's sitting at that table there in a vest? Yes, sir. The microphone is with you. And then we'll get another one over here if we can. There's a gentleman near the front there, and we'll work our way backwards. Yes, sir.
Okay, just as a quick intro, I lived in Asia for 14 years. The majority of that was in China. I worked there for 30 years with Chinese companies, et cetera. I will say I'm much closer to Keyu than Matthew at this point in terms of the thought process and the outcome and where it goes. It's important for people to remember China has 4 times the US population, which lives on half the landmass. It's basically, imagine 1.4 billion people east of the Mississippi, right? What does China care about? What have I always taken away from my time in China? Is stability and economic progress, pulling people out of poverty. And China's probably pulled more people out of poverty than the rest of the world combined. Keyu, my question actually is for you. I think all this talk about Taiwan is overblown. What is the risk to American citizens, American consumers, the American economy of a complete rift with China whereby we're not able to import the tariffs that are talked about are a tax on the American consumer. It's not what Donald Trump said, that China pays for it. The US consumer pays for it. What happens in that rift? Because you're an expert in international trade flows. Thank you.
Keyu, that's a question to you.
Well, when we say that China has already assumed some kind of normality in terms of this, kind of disengagement, economic disengagement with the U.S., China's primary trading partners in renewables and all EVs is with Europe. So it matters much more what Europe does in terms of policies to China than the rest. But I gave you the example of Tesla, right? And all these American companies in China. Apple, for instance, still making huge profits in China. I think they make really, a very important combination. The Chinese youth still love the NBA. They love Hollywood movies. We need to keep them, keep that going. But I think that banning, sanctioning companies left and right, banning Chinese investment going to the U.S., 22% drop in Chinese students going to the U.S. since 2019, but 85% of Chinese students have returned to China. That's voting with their feet. So keep the knowledge exchange open, keep the collaborative research. And by the way, for every $1 that U.S. spends on renewable investment, China spends $3. It's important.
Matt, it's undeniable that there are costs to U.S. consumers of worse relations with China.
Yeah.
What's your answer?
Let me ask, sir, have you considered what the cost is of allowing China to continue stealing American intellectual property or the hollowing out of our manufacturing base? Is that not a tax on the American people? What about fentanyl?
American companies are willingly giving their technology to Chinese in order to have access to the market.
I personally
it's $1
interviewed
billion for consumers.
Yeah. Okay.
American companies want that access, and they're not forced to give it over. Microsoft doesn't have to give source code. They make a conscious decision at the CEO board level to do that for access.
When the U.S. Trade Representative Bob Lighthizer opened this investigation into the systematic theft of our IP, as well as policies in China that require you, as the condition of getting market access, again, you could say, well, it's fine, we just give up the Chinese market. But if you want that access, you do have to give over that IP. And that has only intensified over the last few years with China's new laws that require all data in China, all data, to be not only accessed, but controllable by the government. So what about fentanyl, right? I mean, Beijing, Congress just came out with a bipartisan report that said not only is China the main provider of all the chemicals that are being synthesized into the fentanyl, the illegal, not the legal stuff, the illegal fentanyl that's killing 80,000 Americans a year. The Chinese government is also providing sustained, robust subsidies to those companies to keep providing the poison on our streets. Is that not a tax on the American people?
Keyu wanted one last word, and then we're going to go to the next
Matt, the
question.
opposite is actually happening with EVs and renewables. Look at what European companies are doing. They said they want to invest and sign joint venture companies with the Chinese companies to get their technology. And what happens? They're happening everywhere, all around Europe. It's just the cycle. China has a better technology. They're going to work together, access for market. It's just flipped.
So we could obviously keep this one going, but I want to get as many questions in as possible. There's a gentleman right there in the blue shirt with a hand up. The gentleman to your right. Yes, sir. And
since you all have outlined that Xi and Putin are buddies, why, in your opinion, has not Xi prevailed upon Putin not to put nuclear weapons in space, which would threaten all of Xi's satellites as well as the Chinese astronauts?
Andrew, do you want to take a space war question?
Absolutely.
It's a hugely important question.
Because Putin and Xi, in addition to having a kind of strongman bromance in their chemistry, substantively have a lot of shared policy goals in opposing U.S. and Western rules and norms in the international system. Of course, in the long run, there may well be some trust issues between China and Russia. In the short run, Xi Jinping is not going to expend political capital to try to rein Putin in. He sees that type of aggressive military deployment and behavior by Russia as really being directed at the U.S., NATO, and opponents of China. They have a modus vivendi in this regard. Of course, Xi won't rein Putin in, and that's a huge problem.
We have a question down the front here. I don't know if we could get a microphone to this front table. And then we're going to try and take a question from there. There's a gentleman in a nice pink polo shirt.
Thanks. My name is Jared Genzer. I'm an international human rights lawyer based in Washington. And two words I haven't heard on the panel are the words human rights. I previously served as pro bono counsel to Liu Xiaobo, the 2010 Nobel Peace Laureate, from before he won the Nobel Peace Prize until his passing. And I am deeply concerned, having worked on a never-ending parade of Chinese dissident cases over the course of my career, that things under Xi Jinping are dramatically worse for anybody who might actually stand up against the regime. I fully acknowledge, of course, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of debt, out of poverty, and there are lots of positive developments on the economic side, but the repression has gone exponential from everything that I see. And my question, especially for those that are taking a more pro-China point of view, is where do you see human rights going? And I tend to be more in the camp of Mr. Pottinger, among others, in thinking that the world needs to be very, very concerned about these issues, despite cultural differences over individual rights versus collective rights.
David, do you want to respond to that? I mean, it's hard not to observe that the atmosphere has changed. I mean, I observed that at Tsinghua over the time that I was visiting, and the pressures on academics to watch what they say have obviously grown. But it's not only that. There are clearly all kinds of signs of repression from Xinjiang to what is happening now in Hong Kong. How do you respond to the charge that on a pure human rights basis, this does look like the Soviet Union in Cold War I? It's a repressive, authoritarian Marxist-Leninist regime that does not respect the human rights of its citizens.
Well, let me give you two perspectives. Number one is on this narrow perspective, okay, there should be an international procedure, not US alone, to work on this issue, okay? Seriously, okay? Because otherwise, the Chinese says, oh, it's a US trick to blame us, okay? So I think in China, people, including policymakers, accept the international organization talking about these issues, rather than just US going along, okay? Now, a broader picture view, okay? Let's ask ourselves, any leader in any country assuming power, usually, in most cases, there are some fundamental social reasons. Either Putin or Trump or Biden. There are some certain social movements, social sentiments pushing this leader towards leadership. Now, in the Chinese case, looking back the past 12 years or 14 years, it is a social call for China to rein in certain unpleasant aspects of the market economy, like corruption, like inequality, like pollution, you name it, like certain government officials going wild. So it is these concerns which are uniting many people to support some of the current policies. Of course, we people like me, we at Tsinghua University, we oftentimes we feel, oh, this is not good, China needs to change, but we tend to forget the other issues: inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, pollution, corruption. So these are the sources of the legitimacy of today's central government.
Andrew, you wanted to come in?
Yes, it's striking. This was always bad under the Chinese Communist Party, but it's gotten worse under Xi when it should be getting better. Of course, dissidents and people guilty of the crime of living well Uyghur often struggle to have any kind of voice at all. But the indicator that is really telling is some of the most privileged, wealthy, internationally connected Han Chinese are sending their families overseas and themselves going overseas. Look at those numbers, look at the wealth outflow. That speaks volumes. The people with the most privileges, the most freedom to choose, the most choices, they're voting with their feet and their resources. And that's a terrible...
it's a bad metric. And it's not only the people of the highest means that are getting out. We've got tens of thousands of Chinese who are coming over the southern border, people who are finding other ways to get out. Like Andrew said, people are voting with their feet. They do not trust their leadership, and they want to live in a society that enjoys the rule of law. Jared, I'm glad you brought up Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo and Perry Link, my old teacher, is writing a book right now translating his remarkable speeches and writing. Liu Xiaobo is the only Nobel Peace Prize laureate to die in prison, in political captivity, since the first one, who died under Nazi imprisonment. So President Biden and President Trump both agree. Both of their secretaries of state have declared that a genocide is taking place today in northwest China, in Xinjiang. A genocide. Tony Blinken and Mike Pompeo agree on this. Probably not on a whole lot of other things, right? So I'm glad you brought that up.
Matt, you can go to Xinjiang today. Any of you can go to Xinjiang today and take a look at yourself.
We're not living well Uyghur. That's the fundamental difference right there. Stage management, if there were an Olympic sport, the Chinese Communist Party would always
actually
be at
holding
the top.
the Olympic flag and the Chinese football team is a Uyghur. But anyways, let's get the statistics right. In 2000, 38% of the students who study in the U.S. returned to China. Only 38%. Last year, it was 85% by the time of last year. The wealthy people, they left because of the COVID lockdowns. Some of them will be coming back. Some will be staying out. I don't think that really is indicative of how bad China is. But I agree with you, there are human rights problems. Some things have gotten worse, and I agree with you, there has been more control. And if you ask the newer generation, the Chinese people, would they like a freer and more open society? I think the answer is yes.
Talking of voting with
the Chinese people don't get to decide. It's Xi Jinping. So we should be talking on policy about Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people.
I'm going to take another question from the gentleman in the pink shirt. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for calling on me. There's a benefit to wearing a bright color, it seems.
Always wear pink shirts.
Two topics I'm surprised also haven't been commented on by the panelists that relate to national security conflict. One is whether there's any, or what are the pressures from the projected demographic collapse in China for security conflict in the near term. And the other is the conflict over control over critical natural resources throughout the developing world between China and the U.S., which it seems like the U.S. kind of abandoned its position under multiple administrations over the last 20 years. And what's the current state of that, and how does that impact the security conflict?
Do you want to take that?
Do you want to talk? David's an economist. I would defer to him on the demographics question, because I don't know to guess on what that would mean for Beijing's national security policy, I don't know. It's clear that there's a problem.
Very quickly, a few simple facts. Number one, the so-called one child policy, okay? That policy actually did not generate only one child per on average, actually 1.8. In reality, it's not implemented to the letter, okay? So 1.8, still that one-child family planning policy saved China, whatever, okay, reduced population by 300 million. It's a fact. It's a fact. It's a painful process. So it is a whole population of Europe is not there in China. Okay, it's a simple fact. You can discuss implications, carbon climate control, carbon emissions, so on and so forth. That's a simple number one fact. Number two fact is that despite the population decline, people live longer. People live longer. The public health is increasing by roughly about 80 days a year. The life expectancy, okay? And also education level goes up. Now, 60% of young kids go to colleges. The number may be too high. So the implication is that for labor supply issue, supply of labor is not there. It's not a concern. Because quality of labor and the active population actually is still increasing between now and 2050. However, there's an issue of demand. So older people desire different things from young people. So the structure of the economy will change. But in terms of labor supply, in terms of productivity, in terms of growth rate, these things, the consequences are not there, okay? Natural resources, it is Chinese companies, including a lot of private companies, which are going to Africa to secure a lot of resources. This is a fact. This is a fact. It is not a government policy. It's not. I talk to them a lot. And these entrepreneurs are oftentimes very risk-taking, very much reckless, okay, in my view, okay? I often advise them, don't go there, oh, there are lots of political problems in Africa, okay, be careful. But they have this kind of, who knows, where are they from? Very adventurous, very adventurous. This is a fact, so I provide facts for you to think about.
Okay, you've written on this question of demographics, and I don't think you disagree with what David just said.
Demographics is not China's main or first order problem. And by the way, just looking at this country, you don't need to have an aging problem to have huge fiscal deficit issues, right? I think the one-child policy, for all the bad things that are associated with it, one thing we have not talked about is this massive rise in the power of women. I find that to be very important. 40% of people born in the 1990s that are business leaders are women. And beyond demographic, it's more the education and skill mismatch that is at the heart of Chinese unemployment youth. 100 million highly educated college graduates, where are they going to work? There are 25 million jobs in manufacturing, but they don't want to go there. The mismatch is more important than the aging problem.
So I'm glad you mentioned women, because I want to make sure we get some questions from women in the audience. There's a lady down here who is being very patient, and there's a lady in a blue dress right in the back corner who was supposed to get the mic, but because of my signaling, it went to a gentleman in a blue shirt. What we're going to do to mix it up is we're going to have 3 questions in a row. First the gentleman in the blue shirt, then the lady in the blue dress, and then the lady right at the front, and then we'll go back. And there's we'll do 4. How about that? We'll do 4, and we'll get the lady in the front here. So you're first, sir, and then it's the lady's turn.
Thank you very much for your expertise and wisdom for the panel. I'm just a layperson, a physician, so I'm learning a lot from this. What would happen hypothetically if China were to annex Taiwan, take it over? How damaging would that be to the West from a political and economic standpoint?
Okay, great. That's question 1. What would actually be the consequences of the annexation? And can we get a microphone to the lady in the blue dress at the back? And then we'll go to the front for 2 questions. Yes,
Thank you.
please,
Thank you for a stimulating discussion. So some of the discourse seems to go down to the point of lack of understanding or maybe patience with each other's point of view. So in terms of mutual understanding, public diplomacy, and specifically cultural and professional exchanges, have proven to bear real tangible results. If you look at a lot of the leaders worldwide, you'll notice that at some point they have been to the United States on programs funded through the U.S. State Department or some other funders, often actually early in their career. So that really shapes up their policy decisions and business decisions and whatnot. So the question is, what role do you envision for public diplomacy in balancing some of the discontentious relationships between China and the United States?
Thank you for that question, the role of public or cultural diplomacy. Question 3, yes, please.
My question is about censorship. You had a director, Chloe Zhao, who wrote a film, No Man's Land, and won a Golden Globe and Oscar. And she mentioned growing up in China was a place of lies, and then was completely censored. How do you feel about that?
Question 3, censorship, Chloe Zhao's experience. And for the 4th question, yes, please, madam.
Hi, I'm Doran Pennell, Duke University. My grandfather actually worked for AID and was based in Taiwan for decades. Last year at the security forum here, the number 2 Aspen Security Forum, somebody from China said on the last day, Taiwan belongs to us and we're going to take it back. My question is, how and when or where? What do you all think?
Fantastic. Well, we've got 4 questions, 2 specifically on Taiwan. So we'll start with those, and then we'll go to cultural diplomacy and censorship. And I don't want everybody to answer every question because we don't have time. We're down to 10 minutes, folks. So I'm going to have to break this up a bit. What are the consequences? I'm going to throw this at you, Andrew. What does it actually mean if China successfully takes control of Taiwan? Suppose in a scenario where, whether it's a blockade or an invasion, the US government simply rolls over because the costs of fighting look too high. What would the consequences be?
Well, I don't think that would happen, but we do have to look at the catastrophic consequences that would ensue, and that's why I applaud Matt for launching and editing the volume that Boiling Moat, which I'm honored to have contributed to. Simply put, it would be a defeat from which neither the U.S. nor its allies and partners nor the international system could fully retreat nor easily recover from. And the single biggest thing you need to think about is that Taiwan is the OPEC++ of advanced semiconductors, the backbone of nearly every strategic industry today, and literally the lifeblood of the big data world in which we live. That is a critical stake. There are other important ones detailed in the book that include credibility of U.S. alliances, the significant chance that those would lose their credibility. The U.S. would lose its ability to stabilize the international system in the way that it has. Japan and South Korea could quite possibly pursue nuclear weapons. It goes far beyond the extinguishment of a vibrant democracy of nearly 24 million people. But I think that democracy in itself is important, and it shows that it's the one democracy in the world in which a significant number of the founders are people of Chinese heritage, among other diverse cultures and ethnicities in Taiwan. Tremendous amount at stake. It would be catastrophic.
Matt, Taiwan belongs to us. Does that mean TSMC would belong to China? Reminder, 92% of the most sophisticated semiconductors, all of those designed by NVIDIA, your currently favorite company, are manufactured by TSMC in Taiwan. Tell us a bit more about what the implications would be for the world economy if Taiwan came under the control of Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, it would be potentially a Great Depression immediately following a conflict. Even a blockade of Taiwan that doesn't destroy the infrastructure could be incredibly damaging, because all those semiconductors that come out of Taiwan, they need electricity to make them. It's a huge amount of electricity. Taiwan does not produce much of its own energy. It has to import it. Every day there are ships coming in with LNG and coal to power that. So if there's even a blockade, you could see the potential for TSMC to go dark or to be throttled back in ways that would be hard for it to throttle back up. It's really a black magic that making these really high-end semiconductors, and TSMC is unquestionably the best company in the world at doing this, but it's a little bit like a human brain. If you cut off the oxygen, letting go doesn't mean that the brain comes back to full function. There are all kinds of inputs that go into the TSMC plant. It's foreign engineering and inputs and metrology, and every time there's an earthquake, and they happen all the time in Taiwan, you have to recalibrate, and they depend on a steady supply of inputs from abroad, even the software updates for their equipment. So we could see a long emergency economically, even from a short strangulation of their economy.
David, can I ask you the censorship question? Has your book that you were showing us earlier been published in the People's Republic of China? Can I get it there?
No, it's published in the U.S. by W.W. Norton, not in China.
What is that censorship?
Yeah, okay. I'll explain to you. Okay, if this book were translated word for word into Chinese, I will be in certain kind of trouble. Why? Because the way I explain how Chinese politics work is different from, in terms of language, from the official approach. Even though in terms of substance, in terms of facts, no difference, okay? So that brings me to a point. Let me claim, in all societies, including the US, there are code of speech. Nowadays, you know this very well, presidents of universities being fired, right? You know, this is a big issue. You establish your university partly trying to resolve this issue. Every society has this problem. In order for your message, for our message to be conveyed to the other parties, you have to make sure the format of the message is appropriate, is comfortable, is not offending. Right? This is, I'm trying to approach this from a philosophical point of view. So in China, there are ways to express politically, different or anti-government, anti-Xi voices. There are millions of ways in Chinese social media. People manage the code of speech. People who read, people who write, people who analyze these messages all understand. So it's a matter of code of speech.
People get arrested for holding up a blank sheet of paper. That is a fact.
Yes, true. But that is also...
Which hasn't yet happened at the Stanford campus. Give it time, though.
Listen, that protest served its purpose, sent a strong message to the top leaders, and they changed, as Keyu just mentioned moments ago.
Keyu, can I ask you?
So it's all code of speech.
We're running short of time, David. Keyu, any thoughts on public diplomacy? In a way, you've been a kind of ambassador for China since I've known you. I mean, could we do more? I mean, you began by talking about mutual misunderstanding. Could we do more in the sense that the lady asked about public diplomacy?
Well, first of all, we need to talk more. We need to mingle more, not twice a year, probably twice a month. And I still believe that the channels have to be open for information exchange and flows. Look, the younger generation, thanks to the Western influence and the culture and the movies, they do have a different view of the world. It is very difficult to force down the old ideology on them. And 400,000 of them came to the U.S. every year to study. Don't tell me that has no impact, right? But when you cancel visas, when they're forced to line up borders on Mexico to come in, that becomes a problem. Many of them are now going to the UK, to Australia. The parents don't feel like they're safe. And the research, science collaborations, medicine collaborations, I mean, renewables, global collaboration, that has to keep going, right?
So we are down to the last 2 minutes, and there really isn't time for any more questions from the floor. Apologies. I want to ask each of the panelists one simple question with the remaining time we have. One recommendation that you would make to the president of your country, I would say the next president in the case of our American panelists, but give one recommendation. David, perhaps you could go first. If you have one recommendation to President Xi to improve U.S.-China relations, what would it be?
My recommendation is to be patient with the U.S., fully understand the American concerns, fully understand American concerns, okay? Be patient, be frank, be pragmatic with American counterparts, and push as fast, as quickly, as fast, as extensively as possible, social and people-to-people exchange, and also to push for domestic economic social reforms.
Matt, one recommendation, whether it's President Trump or President Biden, one recommendation.
Yeah, to remember that the Chinese people are our allies, even though the Chinese Communist Party is certainly not. I would also remind a president that Xi Jinping is not playing for a stalemate. He's playing to win, and so should we.
Keyu, one recommendation to Xi Jinping.
Start with small victories that can go far, and fentanyl collaboration was one of these examples.
And finally, you get the last word. Andrew, if you've got one recommendation to the next president, whoever it is, what would it be?
Do whatever it takes to hold the line on deterrence through the 2020s, and your successors should engage in catch-up cooperation that will then be possible in the 2030s.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've had the privilege of listening to 4 experts. A big round of applause to them. Thank you all.